There we go. All right. So, 10th episode, final meeting on Magic Mountain, and we've just been chatting before I hit record here a little bit about what we may or may not have to say. I'm feeling a little bit of loss. Partly, I think. I don't know what the jiu-jitsu equivalent of an English, thing would be here, but I feel like in some ways I sort of started tapping on this novel a couple hundred pages ago, and I'm just kind of glad that it stopped wrestling finally.
Yeah.
What's the joke? The thing about fighting a bear is the fight's not over when you're done. The fight's over when the bear's done.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like this applies to Thomas Mann as well.
Yeah.
To some extent, but so we've got our last what was it, about 70 pages, 80 pages, something like that.
It's like 84 pages
to completely put the novel to bed.
Yeah.
I said earlier I don't have a whole lot of, there are definitely a few things I want to say, but I don't necessarily have a whole lot of organized stuff. And I know at some point we want to talk about our sort of bigger picture sense and the sense of, what some of the outside stuff we've been looking at the last little bit says. But I don't know. Just give us your take here.
Well,
where should we start?
A little bit of synopsis, maybe.
Yeah.
We started off with the subsection of the chapter called Fullness of Harmony, where the Hoferat introduces the record player, and he says, I myself am still into vinyl, and I know a lot of people are, and it kind of got me thinking, I bet that like in, circa 2015 through now, 14 through now, I bet when people read this novel, they get to that part and they recognize the vinyl renaissance for what it's worth, like the carefulness with the arm and the changing out of the needle and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I confess I was too lazy to look up the arias and the operas. That might be something I do later, though. I mean, I've got a pretty decent collection of classical music myself that I don't listen to enough. I feel like it was a rather allusion-rich chapter when Hans takes control of the record player, and he's like, nobody but me.
And there's the musician who's allowed to run it as well.
And but I want to say it's allusion rich, and I bet if somebody did the painstaking work, just like we kind of didn't really do throughout this novel. I mean, all the Faust and the Shakespeare and everything else. I'm sure that if you were a classical music lover, you would probably think that this section was a little hotter than I did. So I will say that.
I wonder about that. I'll circle back to that though.
And then we moved into the next section, highly questionable, where we met Ellen Brand, which I guess was like post Peppercorn, his next nuclear bomb. Like he brought in one more big outside character to Ellen Brand is operating in the tradition of spiritualism.
Right.
I teach this with my students pretty much every semester, this movement that really got kicked off, to my understanding, in the biggest way in the United States, in upstate New York in 1848. But caught fire all along the eastern seaboard and certainly in England and Germany as well. So by 1924, I'm not surprised that we bring the spiritualist in, and they do this seance, one chapter later, or maybe it's in this chapter, I get confused, where Joaquin's ghost shows up.
Silent
ghost, and Hans has to deal with that, and he's given the plate from Claudia's X-ray that he had not brought into the room. Somehow one of the spirits also brings the record into the room that they needed.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of suggestion that Mann is either... Well, who knows what authors think, but I want to say that the seance kind of works. Like, it's a chapter in which paranormal contact is made, I will say. And then after that, and you can push back on all this, I'm just like kind of walking through how I read. Then we got this section called Hysterica Passio, and gosh, it's been about a week and a half. But at that point, if I remember right, everybody's tempers were getting real short. There was a guy whose wife was insulted by another guy, and of course, all of this is, gosh, at some point there's a duel, right?
Yeah.
Between Settembrini and NAFTA, where it closes out. Like, first tempers were flaring in the hospital, then tempers flare between Settembrini and NAFTA. And gentle viewer, if you liked Hamilton and the 10 Dual Commandments and the pathos of Hamilton sticking his gun in the air and Burr gunning him down, perhaps you will enjoy Settembrini doing the same thing. The final duel with NAFTA, where he's demanding satisfaction. He tells Hans, "I will not take human life." Sticks his pistol in the air, fires it. NAFTA calls him a coward and blows his own freaking brains out, though.
Right.
So that's the end of NAFTA. And then in the wake of all of that, we get the Thunderbolt, which is, as I predicted, I must say, a couple of weeks ago.
You called it?
Time catches up with all of us. World War I is upon us. The prologue is no more. And everybody just rushes down the mountain to go to their individual countries because the whole war's engulfed, and everybody's like, I gotta go home. And the last we see is Hans, like, with bombs blowing up all around him, and he's running, and I can see, once again, why people say that this novel influenced Hemingway. And one of the outside articles I read was, I didn't bring it today, but an article saying that For Whom the Bell Tolls was deeply influenced by this book. And I could see that. I mean, the nonsensicalness of bombs blowing up and Hans getting up and running and wondering if he's been hit and wondering what he's even doing there, but he's just got to keep running. And that's the last we see of him.
Yeah.
And that's how the book ends. So plot summary, as my students like to do.
Right.
I will say that my take on it all, I don't know. 500-pound gorilla, I think probably, in my opinion, as a reader in 2022, the novel punches beneath its weight. Like, I just don't... I think one of the beauties of what we're doing is we take a book and we read it for a really long time. And that's an interesting experience. You know, we read the David Foster Wallace book first, and even though I like that novel better than this one, something similar happened to me. I mean, you feel like you're really with the characters and with the book over a long period of time. You know, things will remind you of the book. And even though, like you, I'm glad that the bear tapped out, it is a different experience when you've been reading something for months and now it's over.
Right.
It's different putting it on the shelf even.
Yeah.
For me than other books. So I have mixed feelings. I do maintain that it punched a little below its weight. I didn't love it, but you know, it was an experience. Being in the hospital with Hans for 7 years, and then thinking he's probably going to die at the end, right? Like thinking, well, he's going to be yet one of a faceless mass that's just going to be blown up. And maybe one of the reminders of this book is that I know that the war only got a couple pages, but each person who was destroyed on the battlefield of World War I, it's easy to get caught up in the body count, which was so different than anything the world had ever seen, right? And maybe the whole book is Mon's way of reminding people that each one of those people had an immense interior life that was snuffed short. And I don't know, like maybe it's an anti-war book in this way. Like, I don't know.
When I'm feeling more generous about it, I find myself thinking the same sort of thing, that what this is a kind of, you know, a sort of very, you know, a sort of ahead of its time, sort of psychological sort of assertion of the just, you know, imperative value of the individual.
Yeah.
You know, in this way that in some ways I feel like didn't really come into full blossom until maybe the mid 20th century in a lot of literatures. This idea. I mean, I know the you know the pastoral shepherds were their own people, but I think there's this very kind of contemporary 20th century mode that really kind of doubles down on this idea that no, for real, like even the lowliest person has this incredible wealth of humanity.
Yeah.
And I feel like in my
It's
generous
trying to do that.
in my more generous moments, I feel like it's trying to do that. I think what's interesting about this and what would maybe prompt me to put this on a reading list, or if I'm being honest, probably put fragments of this on a reading list
Yeah.
for, say, a senior level majors class, or one of those where I went to school. It was the 5,000 level class, which now sounds like something from Outcast or something.
Yeah.
But the bridges where you might have some advanced seniors as well as some graduate students, at the beginning of their programs. I could kind of see myself wanting to make this part of a conversation in a class like that, in part because I think that it's this interesting artifact, and I think I'm going to come back to this a lot, so apologies if I get repetitive, but I think it's this really interesting artifact of this transitionary period. It's like the fish with the little tiny legs on it that hasn't quite learned to walk on land, but it is very much a novel of the 19th century. Just in heft alone, it feels like it is more a Dickens novel than a Hemingway novel.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has this very 19th century sensibility. I mean, we have a duel in today's reading. We're working out these
And almost a second one,
Yeah.
when the guy's wife is offended.
and
Yeah.
and we're working out these kind of ideas about faith and positivism and spiritualism and all this kind of stuff. So in a lot of ways, this is a book that feels to me like it's coming out of the 1840s.
Yeah.
But in other ways, it has this aspirational modernism, and a lot of the reading that I did this week, not from the book but about the book, really kind of emphasized that what the people who were sort of praising it were really praising it for being. I mean, one of the articles I read suggested that this is really the first fully fleshed example of intertextuality that we see in sort of European literature.
Like with the allusions, you mean?
With all of the we have the all the Faust and all the opera
Right.
and
Right.
and the music from the gramophone
And pop culture references too, and
right.
fashion. He's
Yeah,
like
all the
he
stuff.
references lots of stuff
Right.
that a careful reader feels rewarded if they
Right.
pick it up. Like
Yeah.
the power of allusion.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think I could quibble, and I would be outside my expertise.
yeah,
I mean, I'll happily admit I would be outside my expertise, but I would sort of quibble that I think we were seeing some stuff from Pound and his ilk at really close to the same time that, for my money, feels like a better example. I mean, if somebody ran in here and stuck a gun at my face and said who invented intertextuality, I don't think I'd say Thomas Mann.
right.
Maybe I should.
But but you're saying that you've seen the argument that
I'm seeing
he's
arguments that
he's an important figure in the
Right.
early.
Yeah, I'm seeing arguments that
Yeah.
suggest that the value of this book is in some ways historical as much as literary.
Yeah.
That it is a distinction I make for my students sometimes is the difference between a thing that's sort of like good and a thing that's important.
Yeah.
And I think the argument I'm hearing in a lot of cases is that this is important. And I get that.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just in a certain point in my sort of career as a reader that I'm not quite as interested in important as I am in good at this particular moment. I'm also seeing some interesting things. We talked about this early on. There was a couple of things very, very recently written about this that kind of suggested that that the sort of COVID days were really the moment to go back and revisit.
I brought something like that too. Yeah.
Not just because of the tuberculosis and the sense of being quarantined or otherwise isolated, which is certainly a big part of what's happening here. But also because of the way that the novel, and I will grant you this, I'm going to complain, I'm sure, a lot, but I will say this. One of the things that the novel does very well is it captures that sense of time loss that goes with a sort of disruption like COVID or like
Yeah, I mean, even if he's hitting you over the head with these long passages that begin with questions like "What is time?"
Yeah.
While annoying, it is true that we found ourselves, everybody that would possibly be watching this, everyone we know, everyone that's not a small child,
Right.
experienced something unlike anything that ever experienced
Yeah.
before in spring of 2020, where there were just these moments, even if you still were working, and I realized that a lot of people just never stopped their routine. There was some class issues that sometimes we forget, but worldwide, a lot of people's lives, including ours, even though we were working the whole time, fundamentally changed in all kinds of ways. And some of it involved, what day is it? What does it matter? Who cares if it's Saturday or Wednesday?
Right.
Kind of
Well,
stuff.
I mean, yeah. And this is not directly connected to the reading, but I think it informs some things about that. But I found myself thinking a lot about asynchronous teaching,
Yeah.
which, as you know, I did a fair bit of in
Yeah.
the last couple of years. And there is this kind of interesting sameness to that. I have a daily routine if I'm teaching asynchronously. That I get up, I have some breakfast, I sit down on the computer. There are like 3 things on my list that are kind of like got to get these things done first. They're sort of more communication oriented and that sort of thing. Knock those off, take a break, come back, do some grading, knock that off, take a break, come back, and I would find myself, and to be fair, I'm not sure I'm complaining here. It was an interesting experience. One of the things that people talk about a lot, as you know, in our business is the sense of mission. And in some ways, I kind of felt like my COVID teaching came the closest to feeling in line with that kind of mission-oriented approach, in part because it kind of was my whole life.
Yeah.
I was sort of working on one aspect or another of teaching kind of all day long, just taking these periodic breaks. But many days would be sort of still doing some grading or emailing or whatever at like 8 p.m.
And it wouldn't matter if it was Monday or Saturday.
Yeah, and it just wasn't even part of the calculation. And I sort of feel like, in that sense, I came to this novel really equipped to kind of go all in with Hans. And there's that section way back where he kind of goes all in after he gets his thermometer and he has to do his 2-week bed rest and he goes all in on his reading and he's just like voraciously tearing through this kind of stuff and
that happened to me too.
And I felt like, okay, this is a really recognizable moment, and it's not just COVID. It's also kind of like, summer break when you're 12, and that unexpected weekend off, where you were kind of at loose ends and you just burned through 3 novels or whatever. So I guess I'm going on and on here, but I guess what I want to say is I want to sort of say from the beginning that. Because I suspect I'm going to sound different in a minute. I want to say from the beginning, I recognize why somebody would really value this novel. But I also see some really fundamental flaws that speak to some broader complaints I have, especially about like literature from this period, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
So. I guess that's kind of my big picture on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess just kind of leapfrogging off of that, the COVID thing, the article that I brought, this is from a journal that I edit called South Central Review, and we ran an issue last year, a double issue called What is Your Favorite Novel?, where scholars from all over did like a 3 to 4 page little essay talking about what their favorite novel was and why. And I remembered today that one of the scholars chose the Magic Mountain. Her name is Susan Suleiman. She is a professor of comparative literature at Harvard. And, just to share some of the things she says and see if any of this triggers a response. She talks about her experience just reading it as an undergraduate, hoping that Mon would provide her with some cultural sophistication. And, she says at the time, this is a direct quote, the fact that Hans Kostrop and the woman he falls in love with at the sanatorium speak French to each other, and that Mon did not hesitate to give us their dialogues untranslated, was proof of his high expectations from his readers. I knew French, had even learned it before I learned English during the months my family had spent in Haiti, blah, blah, blah. I felt validated. She also has an endnote where she says, in the most recent translation by John Woods, the pages and pages of dialogue in French are given in English with an occasional sprinkling. That's not the edition we had. We didn't. Right. We got no translation.
We got the full French, yeah.
Well, she says, we were told that Hans and Claudia are speaking French in this new edition, but we're not shown it. And then she asks, is that a sign of democratization? You don't need to have any elite education to read the Magic Mountain, or merely the decline of foreign language study in the English-speaking world, even among the educated? She teaches comparative lit, so I'm not surprised she asked that. She goes on and says, something else she says that caught my eye, because I know you had some sort of eye roll feel. Well, she points out that the sort of gender ambiguity of Claudia, that she thinks that is timely for today. She forgives him with the Asiatic Khergit's eyes because, she says, the source of the captivating Claudia Chocu's sway over Hans is her gender ambiguity. Her Khergit's eyes are exactly the same of a boy Hans had been infatuated with when he was in school. We've touched on that a lot. I found it interesting that she says, no, that's a big deal in 2022. Like, Mon sort of, I don't know if he went like bi, or if that's what Suleiman is saying, but there's something there. And then of Setrambini and NAFTA, she has a quote that I thought was interesting. If I can find it, it's a short essay. All I got to do is look for the name. What really drew my attention this time on rereading it, she says, is the often ironic tone of Mon's narrator, his distance from his characters, not only from Hans, but from all the other residents of the sanatorium, as well as the two talkative philosophers, gives a comic cast to the tale, which undercuts the reader's tendency towards identification or solemnity. This, despite the fact that the book deals with some potentially very solemn subjects like illness, relativity of time and space, the desire for death, not to mention love and war and honor. His irony can be unsettling because we are also aware that he takes these subjects seriously. Reading him is an adventure, she says. And then of COVID, she writes, a reader today cannot help wondering whether the pandemic may not have been a similarly deep chasm as World War I, marking the beginning of a new epoch whose beginnings will go on for a long time. The Great Flu epidemic of 1918, to which this one has been compared, is not remembered as epoch-making, and COVID may also recede into the background once normalcy has returned. But Mon's insight about the discontinuities in history, together with his reflections on the relativity of time and space, provoke our thinking just as they did of his first readers and of those who came after. So, she thinks it's timely for its sexual engagement, its willingness to treat somber topics with irony and hilarity, and the COVID thing. So people dig it still.
They do, but there's no accounting for taste.
That's right. That's right.
And I want to say, part of what I think is my sort of visible frustration, I don't think this rises to the level of antipathy, but frustration with this book, is that I feel like it was on the verge, many times, of genuine magic, as the title promised. And ultimately what I got were a bunch of incomplete fragments and kind of very superficial feeling tangents. So, for instance, this business with Claudia and the boy, I forgot his name, with the pencil.
Yeah.
That was absolute fire when it first appeared. When Hans made that connection
During the nosebleed, especially. Yeah.
and I was prepared. I mean, I've joked about this with you, here and there, but I really think, a good editor could take this book, and maybe this is maybe this would be a great art project for somebody.
Yeah.
Take this book and slash it up into 3 really tight, really good short stories.
Or like just novellas, even.
Maybe long enough for that. I'm not too optimistic.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe 200 salvageable pages in this book in some ways. And this business with Claudia and this reminiscence of this boy, I feel like this is just a really fantastic opening move, but Peepercorn comes along when Claudia returns, and that whole thing gets shelved. And I get it, life happens, and you don't get to kind of pursue these things, but this is also not life. This is a
It's a novel.
It's a novel that's supposed to be sort of organized and plotted, and I feel like obviously Mon gets to make his choices, but this is not a good one.
Yeah.
This is a really fantastic thread that he just sort of lets go loose.
Yeah.
I feel like this business with Napta and Settembrini ending with the duel, this is kind of really interesting. And again, if I were, say, working on this with a student, or I keep saying that mostly because I can't imagine doing any work on this myself.
Right.
I would want to ask questions like, does this suggest something about a kind of bankruptcy of one side of that debate? Is this duel just the kind of inescapable conclusion of this debate, and now the suicide, is it some judgment against this kind of formal religious kind of hierarchical vision of the world, but Mon hasn't done enough for me throughout the novel to feel like he's actually working on a sort of larger plan to make me feel like I can trust, even something, you would think that the guy who's been saying, the world makes meaning through top-down moral hierarchies. This guy shooting himself in the head ought to really mean something, but I don't know that I can trust Mon enough to really believe that that's what's happening here. And it just ultimately feels like, Eliot gives us these kind of deep intertextual poems. I mean, some where he barely adds any of his own words, right?
Yeah.
And tells us these are the fragments I shore against my ruin. And when Eliot says that, I feel this very strong, very convinced feeling that what I'm seeing is this 20th century person literally trying to gather around himself the things that he thinks might make life have meaning.
Is it enough for you to forgive the recent making of the movie Cats?
Well, I mean, that's a different. We can't blame Eliot for what people do later.
I know.
But when Eliot does this fragmentary thing, and just kind of literally seems to sort of try to make a quilt of human sort of thought and success and beauty and truth in order to get him through these dark times.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Yeah.
What I see in Mon, in this novel, I should say, is not that. What I see is just literal disorganization. It feels to me like, and I think this is probably historically the fact, I feel like, he was working on this big project and it kept getting interrupted. And when he came back to it, he just wrote whatever he wrote. And it really feels a bit like a shambles to me.
Yeah,
It's all these episodes that are loosely connected, that they're not very, I mean, he had a chance to do something here, and I feel like he just couldn't seal the deal.
I agree. I think the. I mean, I would also say that the way I don't think he stuck the landing at all with the Settembrini NAFTA tension, because of how insufferable they both are.
Mm-hmm.
And
I don't want either of them to win.
Yeah, and I mean, I get that. What they're both talking about is important, and there are issues there that we continue to explore to this day. But I guess I just feel like, to make both and maybe there are readers who disagree with us, including Suleiman, who legitimately finds Settembrini especially likable. I'm just not one of those.
Right.
And I mean, I know, I don't know. I mean, at the same time, I mean, for example, I will buy that he legitimately cared about Hans. And that he had that capacity. There are things about him that maybe are like, but no, I mean, I think that part wasn't so well executed. Going back to 2 weeks ago, I think I still agree with your verdict then that the Peepercorn sequence was probably the most tightly executed sequence of the whole novel in terms of having like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in terms of bringing across points that really make you think about jealousy, make you think about gender roles, make you think about male friendship, make you think about what it means to be a woman or a heterosexual woman, make you think about stuff, make you think about what money and power can do for one's aura. And then he died, and we felt feelings and satisfied in some way.
Yeah.
And I guess
it
was a complete arc, and probably to me, and I don't know if others, I didn't see much treatment of Peepercorn in the articles that I read over the week.
Yeah.
But I thought that had the most lightning.
No, if I had to assign this book,
yeah,
I would assign the Peepercorn section and just say, we'll look at Cliff Notes to get some context.
Yeah.
But we'll do close reading of this section. I feel like when it's hot, it's hot. I mean, I agree with you. I don't feel like this duel is really great closure. Suleiman's argument that these two kind of academics are kind of clowns. It's nice. It's the kind of argument I want to believe. Especially because I feel like it is an inversion of the rude mechanicals from Twelfth Night. It's the smart guys who are the comic relief now. And when Settembrini first shows up in the weird clothes and speaking his weird illusion-laden sort of stuff, I'm prepared to see him as his comic.
It's kind of funny, yeah.
But let's be honest, you can't say like, let's do this thing for a lark and then do it every day for 10 years and say it's still a lark.
Right.
That's not what the novel ends up doing with him.
No.
He's not comic. In some ways he is, the moral sort of foundation of Hans's transformation.
Yeah.
And you can't have both of those things. I don't think.
No.
So there's that. But I will say, I mean, I don't think there's closure, but I mean, that's a fire scene. I mean,
the duel itself is beautifully handled.
And whatever else I'll say, I mean, obviously, when Mon sits down to do some work, I mean, he can make it happen.
Yeah.
And I,
Well, I mean, the conversation in French between Claudia and Hans was hot as hell.
Yeah, I mean,
and then you pointed out 2 weeks ago, not only was that conversation in French authentic, in as much as, sometimes guys try really hard and don't know what to say, and this is what happens. Yeah. And then, the scene where just, during the Peepercorn sequence, tucked into the middle of it, when she walks in and she's like, "Do you have an eraser?" And he's like, "No," and she's like, "Ugh." Like, that was awesome.
Right.
It was awesome. The intimacy, when Hans. When it occurs to Hans, and I think I said this 2 weeks ago, I want to say it now if I didn't, just in case, but when it occurs to Hans right after she rolls her eyes, this is an example of how spoiled Claudia is. He means it as a fucking compliment. Yeah. And that is something you as a writer have to work to achieve.
It's the kind of thing that those after-school specials might spend 2 hours working toward this idea that when you genuinely love somebody,
Yeah.
stuff like that is endearing.
Yes.
Yes,
and so yes, he can pull off big things. I think I agree with you though that like the slog of it all, like people have been asking me for the last couple of weeks, because I posted on Facebook that I finished the novel.
Yeah.
And several people respond, well, should I read it? And I mean, at one point I was just like, I would not recommend this book to a friend.
Right.
And I said it to our other book club that we are in. And, I guess it's kind of ironic since we're making a channel hoping that someone's reading it so that they're watching this. But this is also us saying, hey, you were going to read it anyway.
Right.
Here's us talking about it.
Yeah.
But like as far as going up to like, I don't know, I wouldn't go up to my husband or my brother and be like, hey, read this if I were one of y'all, because they're probably going to get a little pissed off if they take it on.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, it is a bit of a failure on our part to not have some voice who's just this sort of unabashed, like, no, this is a great novel.
Perfect, yes.
And hopefully when we move on to the next thing, we might be able to offer a more kind of positive readerly experience. I think we will. But
we had plenty of positive feedback even on this one, though.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I got kind of two things I want to say, and then I think I'm all out.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to say is part of the reason that my negative comments sort of have the heat they have, not to sound like my father. I'm not mad at Thomas Mann. I'm just disappointed. I feel like he had just an amazing novel.
Yeah.
Sort of like in like a hand and a half.
Yeah.
And then he looked the other way and let most of it fall out.
Yeah.
I mean, because this thing with Claudia, first of all, this thing with time. I mean, it is a thing. It's interesting.
It is.
This business with
Joachim's
stuff
being torn between duty and health.
Yeah, this kind of emerging 20th century medicine. I mean, remember the X-ray scene?
Right.
I mean, I think that was the first moment where I was like, "Oh, we're getting down now."
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I was like, "You were 100%."
I'm looking at your heart.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, so the front end was a little expensive, but it's gonna now.
Yeah.
But no, So I feel like there are all these moments where the novel just shows these flashes of just unambiguous greatness, but then I just feel like he kind of loses the thread, and he kind of pitters around a little bit, and then he's like, and the gramophone,
Yeah.
and then and the seance, and all of this stuff is. I mean, I thought the seance was just, for instance, it was just ridiculous. It just tacked on. You know what it felt like to me? I mean, we're a couple of people who teach a lot of first-year writing. It felt like to me that thing that a student does when they get to the end of an assignment and they realize that they're 75 words short, and just in the middle of the concluding paragraph they go, and another thing is,
Right.
and just like start a new argument,
Right.
until they make the word count.
Yeah.
And it felt like I cannot imagine a world where somebody who is obviously as good as Thomas Mann goes back over this and goes, yeah, that belongs there.
Yeah, I mean, part of the point, I guess I interpreted that as like the same thing as the obsessions over drawing pigs and the cards, and it's like you get a group of people together and they go through their fads and their phases, and here came the seance phase. But he devoted a lot of heat. He also placed it like in a crucial part of the book. I mean, he put it in the fourth quarter, right? He put it in the home stretch, like just before the Settembrini NAFTA duel, in fact. And so the placement suggests bigness, and I guess I mean, I don't know. Maybe too, it's like the novel's about death in so many ways, and it's like, well, can we reach the other side? What about the people we've lost? I mean, I can see how he would say, no, in fact, this belongs here. But maybe it was just like the way it all was funneled through the introduction of Ellen Brand that made it feel like a gimmick to me
Yeah,
as
I
well.
think so.
You know, like, oh, it's because of her.
Yeah.
Because but that was a huge warrant of the 19th century spiritualist movement, is that certain
These
women,
charismatic figures.
certain
sure.
women were
Yeah.
the talented ones who could usher in contact between
Yeah.
this world and
I
the
mean,
other.
Straight from her to Nancy Reagan.
Right,
Right.
right.
So I get it. I get it, and I think there's a place for it
Yeah,
in a book like this.
yeah.
But we've been through so much, and I'm not just complaining about the length of the novel.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been through some meaningful stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
I've made investments. I've had losses. I've had
Yeah.
to put the book down for a minute and kind of process.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and then to have this thing, just this whole new thing, in the middle of what felt to me like some serious heavy moments, to just have this whole new thing come in that honestly just felt like his editor called him up and was like, hey, see, the kids are really into spiritualism. See if you can fit some spiritualism in there, and we'll see if we can get Kanye to do the soundtrack. You know, I mean, it just felt kind of
Right.
that. But let me also say, in what I'm meaning to say here is some version of, when he's hot, he is nuclear,
Yeah.
just great.
Yeah, I think so.
But the pieces don't fit together, and my biggest disappointment, I think, has to be, and this is going to circle back to one of my first things from today. My biggest disappointment has to be this very ending, this last page, really this last half page. We see Hans on 750, I guess is where Hans. Yeah, right at the bottom, 750. We see Hans, and he's, as you mentioned earlier, kind of slogging across this battlefield. I mean,
They're trying to take a hill.
it's unthinkably just meat grindery, awful. I mean,
Yeah.
we're both of an age, I think, that for us, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't speak for you here. For me, just because of the way I grew up, the when and where and all that, when I think of these kind of meat grinder wastes of war, I think of Vietnam.
Absolutely.
And of course, I mean, of course it was, but the scale of this kind of
Yeah.
thing is just so much more inconceivable.
Right.
And I mean, we're literally, I think, being asked to imagine a battlefield that stretches as far as the eye can see, just littered with mud and
I mean,
corpses,
not terribly unlike the beginning of Saving Private Ryan is the mood he's going for.
I mean, something like that, and we see Hans coming, and then we get this kind of narrative, and I feel like what happened, on some level, is Mon lost his nerve, and he retreats to this comfortable 19th century narration again. And you'll notice we're into this almost sort of formal King James English.
Right. The second Hans runs over the hill and disappears.
Yeah, and at the very bottom of 751, farewell, and thou livest or diest. And I've just found myself, knowing. I mean, I kind of paused here and flipped and was like, really, 75 words to go, and you're retreating to this ironic distance with this 19th century narrator, this 18th century narrator, narrative voice. You've flirted with all this modernity. You've been racy. You've been alive and feverish, literally and figuratively. And here at the very end, you get cold feet.
Yeah.
And you retreat behind this formal, and I find myself thinking, man, this is a long way to go, right? To a conclusion that ultimately, I mean, literally the last words of the novel, spoiler alert, may it be that love one day shall mount.
Yeah. Out of this universal feast of death, out of this
Question mark.
extremity of fever,
Right.
kindling the rain-washed sky to a fiery glow, may it be that love, and he capitalizes love,
Right.
one day shall mount.
And I just feel like, this retreat to, 18th, 19th century, formal narrative distance, and this kind of abstraction, that I mean, if Settembrini is the comic relief, like Solomon says, he's channeling Settembrini here. He's kind of turned what should be this kind of, I don't know, conclusion into a kind of practical joke without, I think, not in a David Foster Wallace way, but in a way that just feels like a letdown to me.
Like, I
ultimately.
guess what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're saying, the ending would have been stronger if it had just ended with Hans running over the hill.
I kind of
And
feel
just there's no, it's kind of insulting too. You could argue for the reader for him to step in and say, he might die in this war. I mean, as a reader, I was kind of like, no shit,
Right.
Wait
a second, hold on
here. So
Yeah.
maybe just the shock of spending 750 pages with him, and then boom, he's on the battlefield. He's over the hill and he's gone. Maybe that is a tighter, better, more profound way to end the book than to step aside and say, well, even if he dies, maybe one day love wins out anyway. Is not really needed by me either. I agree with that.
And I feel like, man, after several examples of just super high-end writing,
Yeah.
man, this is not it.
No.
I mean...
No, in fact, one page before you had better sentence. You had better sentences when he writes. This is on 751. He lies with his face in the cool mire, legs sprawled out, feet twisted, heels turned down, the product of a perverted science, laden with death, slopes earthward 30 paces in front of him and buries its nose in the ground. This is a bomb.
Oh, yeah.
Explodes inside there with hideous expensive power and raises up a fountain high as a house of mud, fire, iron, molten metal, scattered fragments of humanity. Where it fell, 2 youths had lain, friends who in their need flung themselves down together. Now they're scattered, commingled, and gone. I mean, that's the kind of writing where you go, holy shit.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you that, it is very much as your dad would say. It's like, dude, you're capable of so much more. Look what you just did there.
Right. And so I guess ultimately what I want to do is say, look, I think I get it.
Yeah.
I really do. And I in that way I also understand why this is going to land on reading lists, for quite some time.
Comparative lit qualifications tests for doctorates.
European lit.
Yeah.
One or two. I don't know. I guess two, if they break it up that way or whatever. I get it.
Yeah.
This is a monument to something.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a better reader and teacher than me could really make a lot of hay out of this.
Yeah.
But just as a guy who's reading it, not in some careerist way, but just as a guy who's just reading it.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I'm not going to say I'm disappointed that I read it, but I'm glad to be able to say I can check this one off the list.
Yeah.
But as you said, I'm going to have a hard time recommending it.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We mentioned early on, and we haven't brought this up again. There's these issues of translation and. I guess kind of like temporal as well as linguistic translation. And so, for all I know, I mean, this just hit like a hammer on every page in 1930.
Right.
But today I'm just finding myself lukewarm.
Yeah.
I think I'd want to tell somebody some version of like, boy, when it's hot, it's hot.
Yeah.
But it doesn't spend a lot of time being hot.
Yeah.
And
then let them make up their own damn mind.
Yeah, pretty much.
And I mean, I guess on that note, I'm out too.
Yeah.
We did the Magic Mountain. We'll see what we do next.
Yeah.
I think we have some plans. We'll get it rolling. But yes, we completed a famous book, a big one.
Yeah.
And we're done, and that is a relief.
And it is. If nothing else, it is that.